what I've spent the last year obsessing over is large language models and what they tell us about the nature of language. And I think what they tell us is that language is it's an autonomous informational system. It can run itself. It's self-predictive, and that I believe that it's running similarly in us. And I'm not, by the way, I'm not here to. I'm also writing a book, but I'm not here to pitch it. This is I want to get to the to what I think is actually a fascinating touching point. So the key insight I think that we have as a species from these large language models, all the implications aside, is that language has this property that it's self-generative, that it actually has the ingredients within its own structure to generate itself. And where that leads you, if you accept that human language is actually fundamentally the same, that it's this next token prediction, the same thing that large language models do. What we do is we learn the statistics, the geometric structure of language, and then that actually just runs itself, so to speak, in our minds. It leads you to some very strange places. In particular, leads you to a point where this is kind of an autonomous, almost a parasitic informational system. It's ungrounded. The words we use, like the word red or burgundy or whatever. I think of burgundy as a wine, but of course it's a place. These are words that have a life of their own, simply as words, playing their role within this informational system. At some point, they have to make contact with our perceptual and action systems, but they really do kind of run themselves. And that leads you to the strange conclusion, first of all, that the system is kind of independent almost of the rest of us. And in the case of embodiment, one of the core themes that I've been thinking about is, well, embodiments, and wait for me to finish because you might react, don't react right away. Is embodiment's dead wrong? Embodiment is unnecessary. We don't need embodiment because these systems, LLMs, are disembodied. They don't have sensory apparatus to perceive and to sense. They don't have bodies, of course. They have no extension in the physical world. They are purely informational in this bizarre sense. And language itself is purely informational. Words are simply these structural, informational structural things that have relation to one another, but they don't actually have any bodily presence. So this leads me to, led me to wonder, well, where does this leave the body in our informational system? And I think you're absolutely hitting on, like, the answer is that these are distinct systems. And it really leads me, again, even more sharply to think in this dichotomous fashion. And I want to get your thoughts on this, that there's a linguistic symbolic informational system that we call language. And it's downloaded into us, by the way, also without informed consent, as you point out. In utero, we are already at who knows at which stage, certainly early enough to be able to, we can already measure the kind of responses that happen in utero to the cadences and patterns of, for instance, somebody's native language. So this is happening very early on. And so we've got this symbolic informational system that seems to be disembodied. We know it's disembodied in the sense that we can now do it outside of a body. We can run it in silicon in purely informational on a GPU where it's just math doing itself. It doesn't feel, right? And people ask, is it conscious? And my response is, well, conscious of what, right? All of consciousness is sensory consciousness. It's feeling. And so this leads me to this notion of a really strong dichotomy between this linguistic symbolic informational system and then the feeling system. And the feeling system is the one that I think you're really driving home about. And it's the one that gives rise to what we call phenomenology. All phenomenology, I think, and I've yet to be corrected on this, is sensory perceptual phenomenology. You feel things extended. It's either part of your body or part of the world, but these are sensed. And I actually wrote about this not long ago. That's something it's right now it's just sitting on Substack. But I was amazed you pointed this out. Not only is all sensory processing phenomenological, such that it gives rise to there's a what it's likeness, but there's more than that. There's a there's it matters that there's as an what's the word I'm looking for? I guess polarity or something like that, right? Things are positive or negative, and the consciousness itself is inherently non-neutral. That things, sensations and perceptions are inherently non-neutral. They matter, and I think your key insight, which I haven't really given much thought to yet, is well, they matter for the purposes ultimately of things like survival. And so the mattering is built into our biology, so to speak. The reason why things feel good or bad, of course, ultimately is some sort of reward function or something like that. We can presume is evolved, but they matter because of the avoidance of pain is ultimately the avoidance of things that kill us, and the attraction to pleasure is those things that allow us to thrive and to survive. And so the mattering is deeply embodied, and the actual phenomenology is deeply embodied. This is what I'm obsessed with right now, and for I think fairly good reason that language itself in fact is disembodied, and that language models have shown us that language is disembodied, and the somewhat disturbing idea that there maybe is a zombie, and I've written about exactly this idea that we have a zombie language model running inside us, doesn't really know what red means, but causes us to talk about it, even though it doesn't have the notion of what a red experience is, because it's purely symbolic, and it doesn't have the kind of apparatus that you need to experience a red apple, to bite into one, to have a satisfaction of eating one. It's certainly the case that language emerged in amongst embodied, systems, amongst physically instantiated systems, as a means of communication slash coordination. But that being said, at this point, we have sort of been able to capture it independently of embodied in embodied in a disembodied form, and we can see, like quite directly, that it is a mathematical structure. What it really is high dimensional. We think of it as primarily as a graph, or a high dimensional a vector space where each word is just a point in that space, and then generating language operates in, at least in the large language models, right, entirely based on that purely mathematical structure, without so to speak, the body. Um, I guess first question is, do you would you agree with the statement that language in humans is similarly abstracted away from the things that language would naively think it points to, but in the end, is this the mathematical structure? Do we think, some people respond to, my statement, for example, that I think ultimately the thing talking right now, and the thing listening in you is an LLM. They'll say, well, that's nuts. It's a completely different thing, because my language knows what red is, and it knows what the words refer to. It has understanding, and my response to that is, no, in fact, what I would argue is that it's exactly precisely the same kind of system. It's it's a large language model, just like that. It's vector math, but it's implanted within this larger ecosystem, this cognitive ecosystem. And of course, yes, you and I see red and we experience red. And then there is some mapping between that. There's some coordination between this language system. It has this token red, which it doesn't in any way know what it refers to outside of itself. But there, that but it's still fundamentally just a sort of abstract geometric structure of symbol manipulation. Some people say, no, I don't believe that. And our LLMs are mimicking language. LLMs are, and this isn't about the stochastic parrot argument, although it's related to it. What they're doing is imitating what we do. But when we use words, we mean them in a very direct way. Do you agree with my contention that no, actually, because computationally we're able to see that these models are able to generate a completely meaningful language, that what we have is language, what we have is an LLM inside of us alongside a sensory perceptual system? Or would you disagree with that fundamentally? I guess I want to put that question first of all. What's your reaction to my contention that we our speaking selves and our listening selves are really just running a kind of mindless zombie language system that emerged within a larger ecosystem where it has utility, such that yes, I can say, can you grab me that that object, and you'll go grab it. But the words themselves, the system itself, doesn't actually have that meaning within it. It is inherently sort of disembodied. So the reason why I and others I think would contend that language and is proven to be disembodied. Again, this is all based on, it's really based on the, I think, shocking success of large language models. And the realization in this case is, you said, words require, speech, for example, and that's certainly the case in humans. This is that we can only speak in an embodied form to get the tokens out of my brain and into your brain, if we think of them as this way, to get the vectors or whatever you want to call them. We certainly need to do something physical, and similarly, of course, the machines also are physical systems. But the reason why I can't come to the conclusion that the language is inherently disembodied is because the representation of the language in these systems is arbitrary, and it's purely numerical. What you're really doing is you're tokenizing. You're taking a sequence. You're taking these long sequences of what to us are words, but to the machine are simply are just numerical list. They're vectors. They're just a list of symbols. And what the machine is doing is encoding each word, apple or red or burgundy or wine or whatever, as a particular vector. And that vector, it gains its meaning not by any means by the actual numerical representation. Numerical representation is actually inherently arbitrary. It's just some ones and zeros, if you want to think about it like in the machine code, or however you want, however your scheme is. And it gets its meaning, so to speak, by virtue of its relation in this high-dimensional space to other arbitrarily chosen token representations. And given these purely mathematical descriptions and this purely mathematical relation between them, the LLMs are able to converse. They're able to produce. They're able to generate. Again, pretty much on par. I think there's no benchmarks left, including the Turing test itself, which these systems aren't able to pass already with flying colors, and they're getting better all the time. And so at that point, it becomes hard to me to defend the idea that words are anything but these abstractions. Yes, we have to say the word red or wine, but that is how we are symbolizing what I think are ultimately something very similar to the LLMs, which is just a point in this high-dimensional space, such that there are relations between the words. The same way that the word doesn't really have meaning, right? The word red doesn't mean red in any deep sense. It's literally just a way, in my view, of doing the same thing that the models are doing, which is namely, here's the point in that high-dimensional space. So I think the reason why people tend to see it as disembodied and why this is evidence for disembodiment is because it is thoroughly and utterly removed at this point from any sort of physical instantiation. Yes, you got to build a machine to do it, but by that point, it's really a mathematical instantiation. It's sort of it's related to sort of it from bit and all of that. Would 1 + 1 = 2 if there was no physics at all, if there was no material world, right? So we could get into that sort of level of philosophical discussion. But in some ways, these really are abstract entities. These tokens are abstract entities. They don't have a sound in the machine. They don't have a sound to them. That's a codec. After they've been, when they want to talk back to us, you have to translate it back. But when they're doing their thinking, when they're running through and saying, what should I say next? They're thinking in this purely abstract mathematical space. So I think that's what drives people like myself to say, okay, these are not embodied in any serious way. And I would also like to point out that even in natural human language, we have sign language. And sign language is a fundamentally different way of communicating. It was almost certainly a fairly late invention, because we didn't really there's no evidence for large groups of people getting together who couldn't hear. In fact, unfortunately, if you look at more ancient literature, people who were deaf were categorized. I know this from the Jewish legal ancient Jewish legal texts. They were categorized as being mentally completely handicapped. That's because they couldn't talk. And if they didn't have the bootstrap of language, they weren't able to develop full intelligence. And therefore, they weren't able to communicate and they weren't able to develop a linguistic competency. It's only in the more modern era, thankfully, that, for reasons of probably transportation and things like that, you put enough deaf people together, and lo and behold, not only do they learn to communicate in a rudimentary fashion, but they learn to develop a full-fledged language with all the trimmings. It's got everything that a language does. It has all the same expressive competency, but it's in a completely different modality, right? It's gesture. It's not speech. And the amazing thing is that it's able to do the same thing that language does. And to me, that is a really solid piece of evidence that language doesn't really care about sound. Language doesn't really care about the way you're moving your mouth. Language lives even in us in this more abstract space. It happens to be that the way we do it, the way we tokenize, is through speech, is through sound. But there are other ways to do it.
Things by definition itself technically don't exist in a vacuum. And I think it's very interesting that we can actually, as things that don't exist in a vacuum, imagine things that can exist in a vacuum, where we can have these very abstract isolations of things. And I think that might be one of the
Language.
foundations of this language, cognition, perception, whatever you kind of want to call it. And one of the other
Language.
things too about one of the things that I present on quite a bit is this idea of social computation or cultural computation. And it's the idea that basically what happens is, you have all these multiple different nodes of a system, right? You could say they're different minds, each doing physically different things. They're physically different minds doing physically different things that are coordinating towards a shared goal. On sort of the Michael Levin territory, you could say, you want to create a kind of, let's say, a philosophical circuit where each piece on the circuit board is being leveraged for its individuality, right? So for instance, if you have a soccer team, right, if everyone was doing the exact same thing, like they were all clones doing the exact same thing, moving in the same direction, nothing would actually happen in the adversarial, competitive, noisy environment of a soccer game or a football field, depending on where, some of you may be coming from on the stream. And what's interesting is that what I think nature is in this sort of bigger way is it is this kind of very general coordination system. And that's why you can have properties of one life, one mind, that when it does, let's say die or go away, there's aspects of itself that get redistributed to the environment. I mean, the very basic, I guess the basic observation that one could maybe say is that, well, when an animal passes away, what happens? It goes back into the ground. But also think of how plants would kind of die or pass away. They go back into the ground, but they also go into the air. And if there's enough parts of it left, it can actually, see it and inoculate elsewhere, right? I just wanted to say that was a very interesting thing about the idea of nature, let's say nature computation, cultural computation, that kind of idea. Again, I've had the fortune of many things, but one of the things that I cherish the most are just what I call psychedelic conversations. Now, apparently, sometimes I also deliver these to people unknowingly, whether intended or not. But what I mean by that is that you a lot of times you actually bring up more questions than things that you'd answer, and it really gets you thinking in extremely different ways that you would normally never get yourself to thinking before, right? Um, I know the experience of that firsthand when I talk to people, and there's just some things where I'm like, how did you even think of that? Like I thought that I had these things kind of mapped out in my head and figured out, and then you're coming at it from some completely different angle that I ever never even knew existed, right? It's like why I always talk about the unknown unknowns and the blind spots that you don't know that you have, right? And I think that's why conversations like these, especially when there are actually differences in perspective and disagreements, are actually in the long run the most enlightening.
Right. Just to tie together these various points. Here's the thing, you know, I was speaking really specifically to the particular ecosystem that we're living in right now, and the development of these large language models, and just, you know, I think being a little bit steely-eyed about what's actually happening. I don't want to sound, you know, too cynical, but something that the language then thinking, obsessing over these language models and thinking about language as this informational system has really opened my eyes to is that these are really cultural artifacts. The language is not, no human being invented language. It was developed as inherently a coordinative tool, and it emerged. It really wasn't an invention. And maybe we think somebody invented the wheel or somebody invented, you know, gunpowder, right? That we could say that people invented these things. No person invented language. Rather, it seems somehow very mysteriously to have emerged out of the ecosystem. And a lot of our cultural mores, the things that we're doing as a society, very often, for example, people go to war on behalf of a tribe or a country. People will sacrifice themselves for a religion. People are very often not geared, their actions actually belie a simple notion of survival. What's driving them is something emergent, something cultural, I think very strongly tied to language, but not entirely based on language. But I think it has the same address. When we think about higher goals and aspirations, things that we might even, you know, give our lives for, or certainly make great sacrifices for, it's not only for kin, it's not only for like family, and you can tell some Darwinian story about that. It's for things like truth and humanity, and ethics and morals. And these are emergent from the society, and these very much drive individual humans. And so I wonder how you think about that. And maybe I know it's a big question to bring up this late in the conversation, but thinking about homeostasis and thinking about survival, to me, in some ways is kind of is not taking into account, or well, I guess, how do you think about these larger than the individual kinds of motifs that drive us, that clearly are so actually such a major factor in human society and societal behavior? And just to push that a little tiny bit more is that language in some ways emerged as a way of outsourcing that discovery to others, right? I don't have to go in the cave and find out if there's a saber-toothed tiger because somebody went and they can tell me. It's a way of extending our minds.
But I was going to say that, yeah, a lot of what you're talking about does sound like the cognitive light cone concept from Professor Michael Levin, and sort of the idea of how you're expanding the radius, right? The things that you could consider part of yourself, things that are worth caring or emphasize or, you know, empathizing about, or whatever. And I think another way to think about that in the sort of social computing, cultural computing paradigm is that in order to sort of extend your mind to another system, you have to almost relate to it in the way that you would relate to an aspect of yourself, right? So one of the things that I've noticed, you know, by socializing and having very, very intricate conversations with people across the neurotypical neurodivergent spectrum, right, which is a whole thing on the social computing we can get to another time, is that a lot of what happens when you're trying to build this coordination system, right, between different kinds of players in a field or whatever, is that you're trying to connect with the other system in the way that's kind of most natural to you. So it's very easy to kind of leverage that, right? It's very easy on a computer if it fits the physiological constraints versus if it's something different that your body or your mind is not necessarily trained on. And I think this is also the thing with the way that we converse using this thing that we call language, because one of the things that's interesting is like a lot of what happens over different kinds of disagreements or conflicts of perspective is that you're trying to kind of establish, does your red mean my red? But I think the fascinating thing is that even if our reds are not technically physically the same, we can still coordinate our actions. It's almost like it's less about is your red my red, but more about how your red relates to the other, you know, colors on the color wheel and how mine does. And if the relations are the same, then we can still make that work. And that's also the reason why we can translate between different languages, we can convert between different currencies like Canadian dollars to US dollars and all that kind of stuff, right? Because I think that's kind of a big part about how this whole thing works.
I know we're going to get to questions, but I have to intervene on this point because it's so close to something I've been thinking about a lot, which is, this word read, and language has this coordinative. I don't even think it is communicative. I think it is coordinative, and it has this coordinative role. And there's something very interesting. There's a very important insight, I believe, into the hard problem and the nature of the mind-body problem, namely that language is the means by which we've created this concept of an abstract third-person world. It's language. I say the mind-body problem is language's problem in some sense because it's an objectification where I would say there's this thing, there's a color called red, and that exists independent, a mind-independent thing, and we can, and it's in some sense true in the sense that we coordinate around it, and we can both agree that's red. But then there's this experience of red, which is in fact fundamentally distinct from that thing that we call out there, a color that has this objective property. And so I think to a large extent the entire problem that we have of how does physical objective stuff lead to subjectivity? You actually started, Anna, you started with this. I don't think children have a mind-body problem. I don't think animals have a mind-body problem. I think we create the mind-body problem when we start talking about physics and atoms and quarks and materials that are viewed from nowhere, objective properties. And then we're saying, well, then where does the subjective come from? The right question is, well, where does the objective come from? There is no objective. The objective is a construct. And so I think that I just wanted to sort of point out that this coordinative role of language, I think, is fundamentally tied to its limitations. Its limitations because it has to have this role where my red and your red mean the same thing in terms of our coordination of behavior, doesn't speak to my subjective experience of red. They're ultimately they're orthogonal to each other.
We should probably take a couple of questions now. Let's see. Jess has a question for Elan. Is there a piece of writing somewhere that elaborates on what language is to you and or what level it's at that you're describing it? I feel I ought to know,
Well,
but want to find out specifically.
you are, thanks. I should slip you a 20 later. So this is my chance to self-promote. So I am planning on publishing a pretty large tome. This is it's a pre-publication, preprint, an archive. I expect that. I keep saying this week, but it's been this week for about a month now. And it's going to
Perpetually
lay
a
out
week away.
the Yes, exactly. And that is especially a week away, but I mean it this time. I wanted to coincide with some other events that are coming up. In particular, like did an interview with Kurt a couple of weeks ago now that about my theory. So if you go to my Substack, so you can check out my Substack. It's Generative Brain, or I think you just my name. You'll find it. I do write about this quite a bit, but there's this giant paper that I've been working on for several months now that lays out the core theoretical framework and also what I believe is the evidence for it. So I'm not just making this up because I think LLMs are cool. I do have a pretty substantive reason that I think that they actually explain human language and other details of human cognition. So please be patient for that. But check out my Substack in the meantime. Check out my interview with if you haven't seen the Theories of Everything interview from about a month ago. The theory that shatters language is how Kurt colorfully titled it. But that you can find that on Kurt's channel. Lays out quite a bit about this theoretical framework, but it's not just mine. Wittgenstein kind of said something along these lines. I have lots to say about where Wittgenstein stopped and where I think we now are. He was really talking about language as a coordinative tool, as a tool for what it does rather than what it means. And I would say that is an essential feature. What he doesn't, of course, have is any sort of computational framework for how it does that, what it means that it does. I think that's where we're, as a species, we're at just the beginning of understanding language as doing rather than meaning in this sense. I think I'll have to refer you to my future writings to some extent, although certainly worthwhile to check out Wittgenstein and many of the semiotic literature and a lot of the Derrida. A lot of these philosophers of language were certainly inching around this sort of same core idea, but they didn't have the computational machinery to pursue it
Yes.
in any deep sense.
Yeah, I'm totally on board with that. I also have a paper. I put it off for a long time that I think just sort of complementary to this effort that you're going with. As a side note, I'm super excited that we had this talk because we had someone like in the embodiment camp and the Borrelia lineage, which I know a decent amount about, and that's kind of where I'm coming from with certain things. But I really want to see the paper that you're writing, and I'll look more at the Kurt thing. I've seen it, but not in its fullness, because I think
It's long.
I'm excited. Yeah, I'm excited about the. I think I really like what you're getting at, and I think I want to talk about it. If I had like infinite time and was sitting still for this whole meeting, I would have loved to interject it and try to say, I think what the embodiment camp is getting at is in this space. I think what Elan's getting at is right here, and there's a very nice connection to them. And I don't feel to have the precision to say exactly what I want to say yet. So I'm looking forward to your paper and doing that. And then also, like I'm a little fascinated with the concept of how across time and generations, like what human beings have kind of said, oh, the mind is a blank, the mind is this or that, has evolved with our understanding of what technology is available around us too. And I think there's a lot to what you said about having the computational wherewithal to do it. And I think I like what you're going on in that specific path as well. So that was my main question and comment. And then I wanted to give it a plus one. Ooh, super loud. Sorry, hold on. I was going to leave on some kind of semi-inspirational remark about how, like, yeah, I think when we talk about language, one of the most fundamental things to think about is like, I think the correct way to see even what we're doing now with all our advances is like there's a very important element of realizing we're the cavemen scraping together sticks and stones and trying to point out stuff. Like that's still us right now. We have all these like fun advantages of internet and language and high speed and noise canceling, but like there's something very critical to understand about what that juncture is and sort of grounding some of the first principles approach to what we're looking at. And I think this conversation is a nice, part of that framing. So I'll leave on that for now. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And actually I think part of what Jess is getting at in terms of how we build up these kinds of systems, and I think it ties into Armand's question here about universal languages, which is also something Alon, you and I we've spoken about, these kinds of things before, is what does a universal language actually look like? And I guess one of the ways I'm interpreting Armand's question before I read out the whole thing is he's basically asking, I was saying, how can you create a language or coordination system that makes you more generally relatable and connected to other kinds of diverse cognitive systems around it? So, Armand's question was, he addresses Anna, says he thinks your thesis is great. Everything emits a frequency. Would you categorize it as a universal language? And without access to enough data of animal or plant species communication data, how would you begin creating a universal language that can be used by humans to communicate with animal species with a human-made language? And, one of the things I think about is how we do kind of have these multiple aspects or personalities of off ourselves kind of by default, not even necessarily like in a more outlier type of DID kind of thing, but I mean even just normal day-to-day life, like you don't necessarily talk to your parents in the same way you talk with your friends over a beer kind of thing. I mean maybe some people do, but a lot of times people don't. And there is this kind of weird context switching, task switching thing that happens. But what would be interesting to examine with actors, and particularly talented actors, is that I have heard these kinds of anecdotes, and I've thought about it just on my own as well, about how would multiple different characters in your mind, right, that you've kind of tried to embody and become, communicate with each other, not using different languages, but using the same language. And that doesn't even necessarily mean they're all talking English, but they mean the same thing when they talk about English. Because the thing about, I think, information and language is there is an aspect that is inherently ambiguous. It's sort of like the idea of optical illusions, audio illusions, where the actual physical thing is technically, that you're immediately perceiving is actually ambiguous, like the Necker cube, which is the logo of Ekkolapto, right? But you have to, perception is almost finding a way to constrain that, right? And kind of project on a purpose or use case to that. And so you'll look at the cube as if it's facing this way or the other way, but it's also the same thing I always bring up in the famous Flo Rida song about whistle. When he's talking about, can you blow my whistle? Is that an actual whistle or is that something else? But the fact that, in the arts, we often actually very much reward the ambiguity and the degrees of freedom of interpretation of what we're writing, drawing, painting, filming, But I think on, sort of more of the STEM side, you kind of want to keep it more constrained. But what I'm wondering is that, can you build some kind of more universal perception language system that lets you more easily go between those ambiguities?
That makes some sense to me. I have just some quick thoughts on that. Well, first of all, I just want to come back. It was Armand, I think. So Leibniz actually envisioned, and according to Kurt Gödel, discovered and then hid. So this is, Gödel may have been out of his mind, or maybe not. Who knows? But Leibniz discussed this idea. This characteristica universalis is like a universal symbolic language, basically a universal language. And Leibniz he invented, well, at least calculus. I mean, he was, one of the greatest minds of all time. So I don't know if that might be something, but you might want to check that out. But more to, more concretely, and what you're getting at, Addy, so there's some interesting papers on this. The idea that all language models, at least, share a kind of there's a shared geometry, even though they're learning very different tasks and they have a very different embedding space. This idea of also a Platonic kind of space that they share. And I would say that in the case in human brains, our perceptual system has to interact somehow with our action system and with our linguistic system. And there may, in fact, be these kinds of universal geometries, or whatever you want to call it, maps, that if we could discover how they work, then maybe there are ways to get around or to develop something more universal, a means by which we could communicate more directly from mind to mind than this kind of clunky system that we had to evolve. That has fairly, so you say it's arbitrary sounds that happen to have these relations to one another. So these are fascinating ideas. I don't have anything substantive to say about how you do them. I'm sure if Will Hahn was here, he would talk about music as being a potential. And music is it seems like a fairly universal language in some sense. Like it's an emotional language, but it seems to be fairly universal. People tend to feel the same things in response to music across cultures and things like that. So there's lots of fascinating, utterly the most fascinating kinds of conversations around this idea. So it's certainly a wonderful question. That's wonderful, and I just want to say that as long as there are people like you and the people who are joining this, and there's such a deep appetite, as you said, for people to actually to understand ourselves and understand our place in the universe. I think it's very heartwarming, and I think it's important for us as individuals, as collectives, to make sure that these incredible technologies and these incredible innovations and insights are ultimately pro-humanity. And I think that's in our hands. It's up to us to make sure that's the case. I don't want to see a purely kind of mercenary kind of outcome of what's happening in this world, and all this incredible innovation. And I think doing the kind of thing we're doing right now is our one little, just to use Addy's term, just one little kind of a step in that direction. And so I really appreciate your time talking about these very deep and intangible kinds of questions in a very, I think, actually a fruitful way. So thank you very much.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll
right.
wrap it up. I guess I missed some of the other stuff, but of course it was an absolute pleasure as usual to have conversations like these, and I am very much looking forward to more conversations in the future.